President Trump took to Twitter this morning, trying to deflect a lot of the criticism he's getting this morning, blaming the media for the anger and rage that led to this deadly weekend. This comes as many people are actually pointing toward the president's own past words, specifically at some of his rallies, where he would use rhetoric like this.
The country puts the name in the basket, and you pick people out of the lottery. Well, let's see, this one's a murderer. This one robbed 4 banks. This one, I better not say, is kidding. This one, another murderer. Ladies and gentlemen, another murderer. Think of this. Do you think they're going to put their great citizens? They have great citizens. They have great people like we have great people. Do you think those people are going into a lottery? No. This is an invasion. When you see these caravans starting out with 20,000 people, that's an invasion. I was badly criticized for using the word invasion. It's an invasion. But how do you stop these people? You can't. There's no... That's only in the panhandle you can get away with that statement. Only in the panhandle. So it's a tough situation, but if they change the loopholes, we'll have it perfectly. And when the wall is finished, it's going to be great.
If you couldn't hear that response, that was someone in the audience saying, shoot them, to which the president said, only in the panhandle. Joining me now, Philip Rucker, White House bureau chief for The Washington Post, Amna Nawaz, national correspondent for PBS NewsHour, Chris Liu, former assistant to President Obama, Art Cullen, journalist for the Storm Lake Times in Iowa, Ron Fournier, journalist and president of communications firm Truscott Rossman, and my friend Bret Stephens, op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Mr. Rucker, I turn to you first. And this quote that really stood out to me, you wrote these words. After yet another mass slaying, the question surrounding the president is no longer whether he will respond as other presidents once did, but whether his words contributed to the carnage. Why is this so different for Trump versus past presidents? Give us a history lesson.
It's different, Steph, because from the moment Donald Trump walked down the escalator at Trump Tower to launch his presidential campaign 4 years ago, anti-immigrant rhetoric, racist rhetoric has been a hallmark and feature of his campaign, of his presidency. And according to experts in the field, it has inspired the white nationalist movement. That's why the manifesto that is at the center of the investigation in El Paso borrows so much of the language that President Trump has used at his rallies, in his tweets. And Trump is unapologetic about this, but it is nonetheless a feature of his presidency. And that's why a lot of Democrats and others are saying his words, through his words, he's culpable in this sort of carnage.
It's not a bug, it's a feature. We've heard that over and over. A number of the 2020 candidates this weekend said that it's the president's comments that have fanned the flames of hatred in this country, and specifically these shootings. But Beto O'Rourke, who you rarely hear speak like this, took it a step further.
Just briefly, sir, can I just ask, is there anything in your mind that the president can do now to make this any better?
What do you think? You know, this is insane. He's been calling Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals. I don't know, like, members of the press, what the hold on a second. You know, it's these questions that you know the answers to. I mean, connect the dots about what he's been doing in this country. He's not tolerating racism. He's promoting racism. He's not tolerating violence. He's inciting racism and violence in this country. So, you know, I don't know what kind of question that is.
Art, not Democrats or Republicans or government leaders. Do Americans see it that way?
Yes, I think Americans do see it that way. At least people where I live in Storm Lake, Iowa, a small town out here on the prairie that's about half immigrant, including mainly Latino. And everybody in this town is locked down in fear of deportation, fear of being rounded up, fear of being arrested, and for no good reason. And so, yeah, it does contribute to a palpable sense of fear and I'm sure rage in other people.
Rage in other people. Amna, you have been reporting on the southern border. So take us to the people there. Have you seen this hateful response to the influx of migrants firsthand? Because it's a community of migrants.
That's absolutely right, Stephanie. I mean, one of the surprising things to me in covering the border has always been that for all the heated rhetoric in the capital and around the rest of the country, what happens in cities like El Paso, and I've been to El Paso a number of times and across the border to Juarez as well, is the two sister cities basically create one large community. You have people going back and forth every day to shop, as the people were in the Walmart that day. You have people going back and forth to go to school. You have people going back and forth to work. Thousands and thousands of people every day. They do not see the same disconnect that seems to inform a lot of our political rhetoric. And that is why I think we have to note as well that the person who went there, who allegedly went there to carry out this mass attack, did not come from that community. This is not a problem in those communities. This is a problem brought in from outside, but it's a problem across the rest of the country. And I do want to be clear about this. This idea of white supremacy is nothing new to this country. As we sit here today and talk, Stephanie, it is the 7-year anniversary of the white supremacist mass shooting at Oak Creek, Wisconsin, that targeted members of the Sikh community there in their temple known as a Gurdwara. And that was under the Obama administration. There was a difference, however, in the way that administration handled these attacks and responded to these attacks and actually put resources to the kinds of things that would tamp down on further attacks. That has not been happening under this administration at all.
Mosques, synagogues, black churches, schools. Chris, the Washington Post reports the counties that hosted Trump rallies in 2016 saw a 226% increase in hate crimes. Is 226% evidence that words do actually matter?
Stephanie, you only need to compare what's happening here in the United States with what happens in other countries. Other countries have hate groups. They have the internet for spreading hate groups. They have mental health challenges. And yes, they have video games as well. But in no other country do you see the kind of violence we have in this country. And it's not just the easy accessibility of guns. You have a president whose rhetoric is providing rocket fuel to the ideology that incites this violence. And he's providing legitimacy to the grievances of these people. And so, look, he can get on Twitter this morning. He can talk about background checks. He can talk about mental health challenges. But these are just more empty words until he speaks decisively with moral character in the way that President Obama did after the Sandy Hook shooting and put his entire weight of his administration behind passing gun legislation. It's just more empty words from this president.
Brett, you wonder what kind of tragedy would bring the country together. The president, among other, is blaming the media for contributing to the hate and rage in this country. That's not new. It is part of his playbook.
Well, of course it is. And by the way, it's important to underscore that this is what a historic break this is in American politics. Remember, George W. Bush, whatever else you thought of him, used to say that that compassion, that family values never stopped at the Rio Grande. Bush's father, Ronald Reagan, also spoke compassionately about Latin American immigrants, inclusively about them. Trump is something else. You know, I reported for the Middle East for many years. I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post, and the Israelis have a word for what Trump is doing. It's called incitement, which is to say when you inveigh constantly, stereotypically, diabolically against an enemy, it's not a surprise that this person or that decides to take a gun in his hand and kill people. The Israelis used to accuse Yasser Arafat of incitement. And by the way, they were absolutely right about it. He laid the rhetorical groundwork, if you will, for acts of terrorism to be perpetrated against Israelis. What the president has been doing now amounts to a form of incitement. And by the way, let's connect the dots here. This is also not that different from the anti-immigrant lunatic who took a gun to the synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed 11 people because he too was convinced that the United States was experiencing a quote-unquote invasion from Latin American immigrants. There is a threat here, and this will happen again so long as the president continues to use the kind of immigrant bashing rhetoric that has been the hallmark of his candidacy and of his presidency from the day he walked down that escalator at Trump Tower.
And Republicans are okay with that?
Well, this is what's so disgraceful about it, which is the effectiveness of the demagoguery, that Republicans have essentially capitulated to a cult of personality figure who is eliciting a kind of a social, a party mania or an ideological mania that has no basis in reality. The suggestion that there is an invasion taking place at our southern border, nothing could be further from the truth.
Ron, you have been covering these shootings, unfortunately, for years. How can we have a healthy Second Amendment? Many people think gun culture is part of American culture. But can you have healthy American gun culture and at the same time sensible gun legislation?
Of course you can. I'm talking to you from Michigan. I spent the weekend, like I do every weekend, in northern Michigan, the heart of hunting culture in this country. There is no need for a military assault rifle and a banana clip to take down a deer. The only reason some of these weapons are made, the only reason they are used, are to kill human beings. The Second Amendment protects the right to, gives us the right to protect ourselves. The Supreme Court, including a right-leaning Supreme Court, has made it clear that we can put limits on our right to bear arms. So we can have sensible gun control. We must have sensible gun control. We are a country that right now has nearly 300 mass shootings this year alone, 1,300 casualties this year alone. No other country comes even close. The closest country has less than 10 mass shootings so far this year. So it's not just can we must have sensible gun control while we protect the Second Amendment.
But haven't we said that for years? Didn't we say must after mass shooting after mass shooting? Sandy Hook was 7 years ago. Those were kindergartners. Right.
Right, and the gun lobby led by the NRA, the gun manufacturers, stood in the way of efforts to try to satisfy 80 to 90% of the American public that want sensible gun control. We as a people have got to insist on better from our politicians, especially from the Republican Party, that is allowing itself to be capitulated from organizations like the NRA. This can happen. This has to happen every time we have blood in the streets, especially when it's American versus American. We have a crisis in this country of white nationalism. When you have that kind of hate coupled with guns at the ready, we can't be surprised that when we're facing this kind of epidemic of bloodshed on our streets.
Art, the last time you spoke to us about the people of Ohio, you took us back to, of Iowa, you took us back to kitchen table issues. That's what mattered to people there most. Do these shootings, while they're not in the backyard or even in the home state of Iowa, does it affect people when it comes to how they're going to vote?
Yeah, I think it does, especially given the context of the Iowa caucuses, where this has been a matter of discussion for some time. And like people in Michigan, there's a strong gun culture in Iowa, and everybody here hunts pheasants and shoots coyotes and so on and so forth. But everybody here also, 80 to 90%, as Ron stated, favor reasonable restrictions on guns, whether it's being able to buy a flak jacket. The guy in Ohio is wearing a flak jacket, a Kevlar vest. We don't need cop killer bullets. We don't need high capacity magazines. And I think almost everybody agrees on that. And I think that people are listening right now, and I think that Beto O'Rourke actually made a pretty strong call yesterday for a kind of a moral renewal in America, and I think that definitely has resonance in the Midwest.
Brett, if the NRA has had one stance, if government has done nothing, is the answer big business to say enough is enough? Is it responsible gun owners to say this doesn't need to be our gun culture? Walmart is the biggest employer in America. They don't need to sell these type of assault rifles.
Yeah, and Walmart does not need to accept the Supreme Court's definition of what's permissible. It's a private business. It can set stringent restrictions on who it chooses to sell what sorts of things to. I mean, if you have to go to a pharmacist to buy Sudafed or whatever it is at a pharmacy, those sensible rules should also apply to buying AR-15s or buying large magazine clips. So I absolutely think that we have to find workarounds around the government, around the NRA, and if business isn't going to take the lead, no, I don't think anyone else will. I mean, these are choices that individual businessmen, like people like the head of Dick's Sporting Goods, can make. And if they do so, they can create a climate in which we say we are not going to allow guns to get in the hands of people who have mental health issues or could have mental health issues or could be prone to violence. That should be something that 98% of Americans, minus Wayne LaPierre, should be able to agree on.
Amna, you cover white nationalism. It is part of your beat. Whether or not it's the president's rhetoric, white nationalism is on the rise. What have you seen since the president took office?
You know, I can tell you flat out, Stephanie, what white supremacists have told me themselves, which is that when they hear the president use some of the words that they regularly use, that immigration should be seen as an invasion, when they hear the president self-identify as a nationalist, when they hear the president smirk and crack a joke after someone says that immigrants crossing the border should be shot to prevent them from coming here, they see someone who to them is, and I'm going to quote one of them here, a rising symbol of white consciousness. It's not necessarily they agree with his policies. In fact, sometimes they think he does not go strong enough. But they look at him and they see someone who reflects some of their values back to them. And what I have seen in other governments around the world when I've covered terrorism and extremism around the country is that it takes unequivocal language to stop that. Unfortunately, this president hasn't been able to deliver that.
A rising symbol of white consciousness. Phil, last question to you. How do you stop white nationalists when the president's clearly speaking their language?
Yeah, well, Steph, it's complicated, and I'm no expert in this, but I think the first step would have to be the president confronting it directly, acknowledging that this is a threat to the country, and condemning it, repudiating it at every turn, and he has done none of that. The FBI has documented an increase in white nationalism each year since President Trump took office, and yet when President Trump was asked a few months ago about the threat of white nationalism, he sort of poo-pooed it and said it's just a few small, crazy people. He has not yet, now 48 hours after the El Paso shooting, he has not yet condemned white nationalism. We'll see if he does so directly in his remarks at 10 a.m., but it would require a real sea change in the kind of leadership that he has shown from the White House in order to confront the threat.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.